Kia ora koutou katoa. Last week I began a two-part introduction to progressive theology by going briefly over a number of traditional Christian doctrines and saying what most progressives don't believe. The term progressive covers a broad range of thinking. For some, it is a commitment to an inclusive, queer-affirming, anti-sexist and anti-racist justice agenda. For some, it is a way of understanding Jesus as a great man without saying he's divine. For some, it's a way of being and praying of oneness. And for some, it is all these things. I included in the readings today an old parable by Anthony de Mello, which begins with, "And Jesus said," although he didn't. It's a parable about two brothers, the older who gives his life in service and the younger who doesn't. Then after death there's a reward scene where the deity gives a big bouquet to the older brother and then gives the same size bouquet to the younger. The parable ends with the older brother expressing his pleasure at the seemingly unfair outcome. De Mello's parable picks up some of the key aspects of a progressive theology. Firstly, playfulness. He pretends Jesus is saying this. Literalists would be mortified. Similarly, the deity is a foil, a literary device for the story. I don't think for a moment de Mello thinks there's a literal after-death judgment scene presided over by a deity where people are rewarded or not. Secondly, the point of the parable is the older brother's joy that his younger brother in the judgment scene gets what he gets. We might imagine the older would be yelling and saying, "That's not fair! How come he gets for so little effort what I got for so much sacrifice?" Instead, his love for his brother banishes any sense of competitiveness. Unlike the scripture text set down for today, Luke 6, where the author in verse 35 tries to encourage the believer to love his or her enemy by promising a great reward. In this de Mello parable, there is none. Reward, that is. Love is its own reward. This sort of loving, like doing good, forgiving, being merciful, is not done for a reward. And if it is, it's not love. For the scripture scholars among you, verse 35, like some other phrases in this Luke 6 text, is an insert, namely words that are highly likely not to be from Jesus. Thirdly, this de Mello parable is about justice, love shaping and defining justice. A justice grounded not in our usual perception of fairness, but in a power of love, which I would call God, that sees each person as beloved, worthy of love, and in need of love. Not a skewed version of justice that grades individuals on what they do, think, or have, and dishes out merit points accordingly. Love, if it's love, is not something one does to please a deity or please anyone. This de Mello story therefore points to a progressive theological method, namely the telling of stories that open up our thinking and make us question existing ideas and actions. Indeed, stories that encourage us to ask searching questions like, Who benefits? Why do they benefit? And what is good news here for the poor? And is God on the side of the status quo, or is God rattling us, disturbing us, encouraging our suspicious questions? Do we have a God, an energy of transformative love that disturbs us? I hope so. Behind the questions, of course, is a vision, what some call the Jesus path or way. It's a vision of eating together, without religion, sexuality, class and race being barriers or dictating the terms. It's what Jesus did. It's what greatly annoyed his detractors. It's what the Jesus groups carried on doing after his death. Again, it is usually stories that flesh out this vision, like the Jesus parable of the great banquet, where a table was laid, but the invited guests were too busy to come. So instead, everyone and anyone is invited. Those who sleep under bridges, those who wear hijabs, politicians and protesters, those who never normally mix and mingle with people who look, smell, speak and act differently from themselves. And in such meeting and eating, attendees are contaminated by the presence of each other. They don't leave the banquet with their prior prejudices intact. In the breaking of bread, the sharing of stories, assumptions can splinter and crack. The other is no longer as other as we had presumed, and suspending judgment, doing good, forgiving, being forgiven, giving, being merciful, all are needed. Diversity and difference are not threats to be avoided, but blessings in the making. This vision is also about progressive method. There is something about doing rather than thinking, action, not just words. There's something about gathering together. There's something about eating together. There is something about letting or helping difference be realized, be heard, and be thanked. As Hal Telsig titled his work on the early Jesus movements, in the beginning was the meal, not the word, not the belief, not the leader, not the book of rules, but the meal, a meal of grace. Grace is a word that carries with it the sense of unexpected gift or blessedness, of invitation. It doesn't come with strings attached, with obligation or compulsion. It's a free gift. It feels undeserved. It surprises us and sometimes discombobulates us. It opens our eyes to wonder and the beauty that has been all along, all around. Sometimes grace comes in the piece of music or a piece of art, sometimes in a smile, a kind deed, sometimes in the silence of the early dawn. Sometimes it comes in being together, eating together, working together. Being touched by grace is hard to describe, and therefore free of prescription. Prayer, in a progressive framing, is putting yourself in a physical place or a mental space where you can be in grace, a channel of grace to others and others to you. This is the Pauline mystical ideal of praying without ceasing. That phrase from 1 Thessalonians is a nonsense if you think praying is solely about words. Similarly, if you think praying is solely about thinking about others or thinking about God or thinking. but letting you go and letting yourself blend with others in a flow of grace, of gift, of love, of gentleness, that doesn't submerge identity or need or failings. This can be working with others, creating something, baking, gardening, talking, listening, or wandering alone. This is a prayer, an understanding of prayer that encompasses all of life. Mystery and grace are woven together in progressive thinking. We don't know why wonder and beauty and kindness touch our lives, but they do. Or why they make change within us, but they do. When it comes to the human heart and the hearts that together form a community, not everything good that comes into existence has a reason, but it comes anyway, making good anyway. This is grace. Grace seeks us out. Grace can transform us. There are many ways progressives think about and experience God. My experience resonates with the work of the philosopher John Caputo, who talks about being haunted by a whisper. This whisper insists rather than exists. Using Derrida's example of justice, he makes a distinction between the call, the insistence of justice, which asks probing, disturbing questions about the injustices in society, and the existence of justice, the tangible institutions and people who put our best attempts to make justice into practice, knowing those best attempts will need reforming again and again. Similarly, says Caputo, with God. God is an insistence, asking probing, disturbing questions. And the existence of religions, faiths, are our best attempts to try to make God, make transformative love real. Knowing those best attempts will need reforming again and again. To frame God solely as a haunting whisper, though, does not do justice to my experience of grace. But grace likewise is an insistence, insisting that we give birth to beauty and gentleness and loving community, rather than an existence. What exists are our attempts to make our world more beautiful, gentle and loving, and those attempts, of course, repeatedly fall short and need reforming. Similarly, thankfulness is an insistence, a deep call within to give praise and thanks for the blessedness of life, even when we don't feel particularly thankful or blessed. And we give substance or existence to thankfulness when we care, for example, for endangered species, or give to the work of the church, or help our family and neighbours. I am what could be called a non-theist. By that term I'm saying that the theistic being, who is allegedly all-knowing and all-powerful, does not resonate with my experience, but does for some progressives. However, saying that a theistic being does not resonate with me does not mean that I discard the notion of God altogether. Similarly, I do not resonate with Lloyd Gearing's understanding of God as a unitary symbol for the best of humanity's values, an atheistic view, though some progressives do. Though always with a degree of skeptical self-critique, I want to claim that my experiences of sacredness, in the whisper, in the grace, and the thankfulness, transcend the boundaries of my mind, and probably the boundaries of our collective mind, knowledge and science. I want to claim there is some form of sacred presence, which I experience most profoundly as mutual love, which the early followers experienced in Jesus and in their communities after his death, which can be called God. And I experienced this form of sacred mutual relation in all sorts of places and among all sorts of people. I'm also attracted to the mystical notion that we exist in God, rather than God being beside or above us, or a love energy all around, or a transformative insistence. This mystical notion, a little like how I was talking about grace, is something we exist within and can flow through us. Using a de Mello metaphor, if we are a fish, then God is the water. And expanding that metaphor, the water of the ocean is not without an agenda. Its agenda is sustaining life, for which an aquatic understanding of peace and justice is necessary. As with last week, I close with a corrective to all that I've said before. This quote comes from the 13th century Dominican mystic, Meister Eckhart. God is a nothingness beyond being. The most beautiful thing which a person can say about God would be for that person to remain silent from the wisdom of an inner wealth. So be silent and quit flapping your gums about God. Blessings to you all.